The Dead is a hard movie to put into words, which is a bit ironic given that it's an adaptation of a short story by James Joyce. This is a short movie. It's only about 75 minutes, but besides the length, there's also something about the structure that makes it feel like a short story. This is a simple movie in some ways, but it leaves you with a big hole. I mean that in a good way. This is a very mature film. It was the last film John Huston ever made. He died before it was released. The movie stars his daughter, Angelica Huston. It was written by his son, Tony Huston. It's called The Dead. Clearly, we're working in emotionally charged territory. That said, for large parts of the film, it's not obvious why the movie is called The Dead. This is a eulogy, definitely, but maybe not in the way that I had expected, maybe not in the way you would expect. A lot of people talk about this movie as an ode to Ireland. John Huston renounced his U.S. citizenship in the 60s to embrace his ancestral home in Ireland. He lived all over the place, all over the world during his life, and shot movies in a lot of different countries. To some extent, I was expecting this to be a bit of a travel film with cameos from the most famous blocks in Dublin. But actually, this movie takes place mostly inside of one house. It is concerned with much more serious things than tourism. Apparently, John Huston was too sick to travel to Ireland to shoot on location. A second unit did those, the few scenes that take place outside. It's possible that's why the exterior shots are so limited. Inside the house, we do see a number of potatoes. We hear Irish accents. We hear about Irish politics. We hear about Ireland and the world. But honestly, Ode to Ireland is not the first thing I would say about this movie. It's in there. It's in there somewhere. But to me, the bigger themes are somewhat darker. Ideas of regret, loss, love, passion. More importantly, maybe the lack of passion, the dead, passage of time. This is a downbeat movie, without a doubt. We'll come back around to some of these themes a bit later on. I was actually in Dublin last week researching this movie. That's not why I was there. I walked past a tour guide talking to a big group of high school students at one point, and right as I passed, I heard him ask if anyone knew who James Joyce was. And there was an awkward silence, and I walked on. To me, Ireland was kind of everything I expected it to be. I don't claim to have any deep knowledge of the country or even the city of Dublin, but let's just say that everything seemed very Irish there. Same with this movie. At the same time, the movie and the real-life, real-world country both sidestep a lot of stereotypes and have depth. Let's get to the actual details. What actually happens in this movie? Well, not really that much. The first hour of the film is a dinner party. I said this movie's only 75 minutes or so. The first hour, we're having dinner. The movie starts with guests arriving. There are probably too many people in the movie to really keep track of who everyone is in the beginning, at least. Sometimes these kind of smaller movies can feel really stripped back if there are only a few actors in them. We don't have that problem here. Sometimes, adaptations of plays, for instance, like that Robert Anderson play/film Double Solitaire that I reviewed on this channel, which has 5 people in it or something like that. It feels kind of cheap in some ways because of how small the cast is. Here we kind of have maybe the opposite problem, which is just trying to remember who everyone is. That'd probably be easier to make note of in the book where it's just written on the page. As a rule, I don't write down family trees when I watch movies, and you don't really need to here. The characters and ideas that matter, they come to the forefront with enough time. We get a lot of different snippets, a lot of different characters showing up. to this house talking to each other. A lot of vignettes. At first, these seem kind of disjoint, but some of them do come together. A lot of the characters are linked together by a personal or professional interest in music. One thing I noticed about going to Dublin, I was researching before I left if there were any cool concerts I could go to in the city, any cool venues. And not really at the time, although I will say that the first night I was there was a Garth Brooks concert in Dublin, which a huge amount of people came to. When I took the bus in from the airport, I saw that they were selling cowboy hats along the side of the road, and I was not sure. I thought, is this some local Irish tradition, the cowboy hat? It doesn't seem like it, but perhaps it is. Eventually, I realized that this was for all the people attending the Garth Brooks concert. There was a sea of Irish headed that way to Croke Park, I think is where he played. Huge, huge crowd. He played tons of nights. Anyway, I didn't want to go to Garth Brooks. I thought maybe there's something else. Looking at the listings for concerts in Dublin compared to the listings for concerts in New York, I thought, man, there is not very much music here. I didn't quite realize just how small Dublin was until I got there. I thought, this is not a music city. But when I was walking around, I kept seeing people carrying musical instruments all over the place, just walking through the city with guitar cases, harps, all kinds of musical instruments everywhere. And eventually, I realized that a lot of this was in pubs, a lot of just smaller venues, more local musicians, but it was a place that actually seems to have music very deeply connected into the nightlife, live music, and traditional music to some extent, connected into the nightlife. Maybe this is a tourist thing to some extent. Anyway, music. Bit of a tangent here, but this movie is also about the musical scene in Dublin. Of course, this movie is set in 1903, so it's not quite the contemporary hits of today. It's not even classic rock. It is classical music, rock only in stone form. Anyway, so a lot of the people at this event are musicians, students of one of the women who's there, too. There's other links as well. We meet an interesting character named Freddie, who is a drunk. Here it might be easy to fall into stereotypes, but I think Freddie is actually a really strong character, not just comedic relief. But from the beginning, you can see that he does not command the same respect that some of the other men do. There is something a bit pathetic, tragic about his life. Oh, but maybe there's also a poetic thrust of it too. You know how it goes, I guess, right? Elsewhere in the party, we see an older woman talking about her son. She talks with a lot of dignity about him as a man with dignity, as somebody with prospects. Before too long, we realize that she's talking about Freddie. They come together, and she's not very pleased with how he's been conducting himself. This movie has a lot of nice little turnarounds like this, a lot of little unexpected moments, like showing up in Dublin to a Garth Brooks concert. A lot of unexpected moments. Later on, Freddie said some things that are unexpected again, more dignified than you might think. He stands up in a moment or two when other people don't. Given that a lot of the guests are musicians, like I said, or performers of some kind, we get a number of performances before it's time to eat. At one point, a man announces that he has coaxed one of the women into singing, despite her vigorous protests, despite her objections. Then the camera cuts to this woman, and we see that it's an old woman. And something subtle just makes you think that probably not that much coaxing was needed. This woman was going to sing no matter what, just as she seemed to have done for year after year. She gets up and sings some, contemporary top 40 hit of 1903 or whatever. And everybody congratulates her on the epic performance. Her voice has never sounded better. Freddie gets up to speak, and you just worry, did he not get the memo about flattering the elderly? Is he going to say something? But no, more vigorously than anyone else, perhaps too vigorously, he also compliments her on the singing. Like I said, we just have a lot of nice little moments, surprises, tricks, characters not quite saying what they mean, the audience understanding a little bit different than what we see. Towards the end of the movie, we meet a cab driver who is lost, not from Dublin, it turns out. Some of these turnarounds are humorous. They're bright. Other things are a bit more downcast. One of the other performances before dinner is a recitation of a poem called Broken Vows. Sounds cheery. Where a man, some person at least, talks about his lover and how his lover does not deliver him the transcendental virtues of love, how they falter, fall short, how the full passion seems impossible. When this poem is finished, one of the younger guests says, "Imagine being in love like that, in awe of this romance." I don't think she took the same thing from the poem that some of the older guests did, like Anjelica Huston's character, Greta, for instance. It turns out that this poem and the ideas there will kind of emerge as some of the main themes of the movie, but not for a while longer. For most of the film, Anjelica Huston isn't really given a star treatment. If you didn't know what she looked like, you might not have even realized which one she was while watching the movie. This changes a bit in the last portion of the movie, but we'll save the end for the end. Besides these little moments, these turnarounds, what happens in the first part of the movie? I almost said first half, but it's the first, 75% of the movie, more than that. Mainly, we just eat dinner. This is an understated movie, without a doubt, and you would be forgiven, I think, for wondering what exactly the point is in the beginning. There is no mention of death, really. There isn't much drama, no conflict. This movie teeters on the mundane. As it turns out, I think this is intentional and kind of powerful. Not obvious in the beginning why, though. It isn't quite true. There's no mention of death, though. At dinner, Gabriel, Greta's husband, gives a little speech in which he implores people not to linger in the past with the dead, with the remnants of youth. Life is to be lived right now, apparently. It's not obvious why he feels like he needs to say this, but maybe there are some undertones of loss in the performances, for instance, in the feebleness of age and the changes they've seen at this dinner year after year. Gabriel also praises the Irish hospitality, that people are able to come together and gather, eat, drink, and be merry with one another. Really, though, this is somewhat tenuous, and as the evening goes on, it seems like there's more and more chances that something is going to derail the harmony. Something will get political, something like that, There's more and more subjects that percolate onto the table that maybe not everybody would agree on. It seems like this cozy, mundane, comfortable life maybe isn't particularly stable, maybe isn't particularly real. After the speech, though, things just get back on track with dinner, more or less. There are no major revelations. There's certainly some nice things about this first part of the movie, but honestly, if this were the whole thing, I would have been a little disappointed. You can kind of sense that something else is going to happen, though. Before we get to the big last 20 minutes, before we get to what does happen, let's touch on some technical stuff, or I could share some more stories from the road, my time in Dublin. The movie has a strong cast, I think. Like I said, big cast, surprisingly big. The music is great. The opening theme, really cool. I'm hoping I can track down a recording of the score somewhere. There's piano performances in the film as well that seem fairly realistic, not too bad. Technically, this movie is in many ways fairly sound, but it does also maybe feel a little bit cheap at times. It feels a little bit low budget, I guess. The print I watched of this movie seemed very worn down. It looked like it was maybe had made its way through a VHS tape at some point. I think the muted colors are intentional to some extent. It's almost a sepia-like look in some ways. But maybe things are a little more soft than was optimal. Of course, in some ways, this movie being modest might actually make it better. This is not some huge blockbuster. This is a final film, a film with a note of loss and regret, and maybe it's fitting that it looks like the film itself might disintegrate. At least my copy did. The film itself looks like it might have gotten lost for a while. Probably you have been to some social event, a bit like the one in this movie, some dinner, a long night sharing stories, hanging out, some of it a chore, other parts nice, inspiring, energetic. Maybe around the New Year, like this. This is the Epiphany dinner, some Christian thing. And that's maybe a time of year, family, cold, passing of time, the New Year coming up. Things are nice at the party, but when the party ends and people start heading home, inevitably there might be some moments of reflection. You step out from the warm into the cold night air, and there's a moment of clarity or something. Maybe this kind of thing is inevitable at the end of a long night or at the end of a long life. In the final 20 minutes of the film, people start to head home. We leave the house for the first time, really. The music changes, and we see a little bit of snow-covered Dublin. We go over the O'Connell Bridge, which I went over last week because kind of impossible not to if you go there. But the movie really opens up, and it gives you this feeling of stepping outside after a party, like I said, into the cold. We also get a couple of plot developments. Nothing too shocking, but I'm not going to spoil them. These are basically the only really important plot developments, kind of the only plot developments in the whole movie. The IMDb blurb for this movie says, after a party, two people have epiphanies or something like that. I don't know if I would really describe these as epiphanies. I think it's a lot more subtle than that. If you're hoping for some huge plot twist, you'll be disappointed. But the ending is definitely, probably, the best part of the movie. Profound. It isn't easy to sum up the end of this movie. I guess one characteristic is that there is a piercing sincerity in how characters face one another, how they look at their lives, and I guess how the film speaks to the viewer. A piercing sincerity. Thematically, we return to the ideas of that poem, Broken Vows. A lifelong craving for something transcendental, for passion, for a love that fixes the world. This is unfulfilled. At dinner, Gabriel told us not to look back, not to think about the dead. And this sounds like good advice, but it's easier said than done. Isn't it inevitable to find death on your doorstep at some point? Or to find yourself on death's doorstep, I guess. The end of this movie has a lot of ideas in it. Love, death, regret. It isn't some jigsaw puzzle that I can put together for you. But it's a profound ending. Quite a switch from the beginning of the movie, and a lot of bang for your buck for a movie that, like I said, is not very long. The movie here zooms in on Greta and Gabriel, but you just get the feeling that everybody at dinner had something similar inside of them. Beneath this kind of charming, kind of lovely, cozy dinner, there was some sort of emptiness or whatever. There was something nagging at them. And maybe no matter what you do, life is really just enough to distract you from some sort of deeper questions. So what do we make of this as John Huston's last film? Did he feel like he was missing some kind of love from his life? He was married 5 times. I'm not trying to moralize here, but having so many people come and go from your life maybe leaves you with these sorts of regrets. Or maybe John Huston had the perfect life and was just trying to warn other people. The very end of this movie gives us a voiceover, and we get the end of the short story. Some people might feel like this is cheating to have an adaptation just read out the ending, but I think it works pretty well. We also get some fairly abstract visuals, some images of the Irish countryside. I think some of them filmed in California. And in this final narration, things are mostly the same as earlier on, but there is one interesting note where James Joyce essentially says that we don't want to wither away. We need to live our lives in full glory of some passion, and that's how we should pass into the other world, in full glory of some passion. And Huston certainly had a bold life. So maybe this is one last attempt at jarring us out of the mainstream and the mundane. I do think, like I said, it's not really that important to diagnose Huston's from afar, but in some ways you could characterize this movie as some element of this movie, some element of the way it works as a drama of emotions. I don't mean a drama where people have emotions or where emotional things happen, but a drama surrounding the fact of us feeling or not feeling, right? The drama of emotions, feeling like you don't feel enough, or sometimes feeling like you feel too much. Different phases of life carry times like that, certainly. And perhaps that's a hallmark of some later phases. Not being in the throes of emotion anymore and being wrestled with that. And ironically, it's maybe the people who feel the most who are the most susceptible to the drama of emotions. That's part of it, but that's a slightly too generalized way of looking at this, I think, because clearly this is also a movie about some specific emotions to some extent. Anyway, it's interesting to think about this film as a eulogy, but this is also just a tremendously moving film in its own right. A very mature movie that potentially speaks more to people who are older than me and closer to that stage of their life, but I have nothing to complain about. I mean, like I said, talk about bang for your buck. A movie I really enjoyed, if you know the sorts of fun, uplifting films I typically like to watch. This falls right into that category. And honestly, I thought that this was going to bring some closure to the John Huston series, but if anything, it makes me want to go back, to go back through all of the movies I've already covered of his and rewatch them, looking for something a bit more humanist that maybe I didn't have my eyes out for enough the first time around. And I'm not going to do that, but it's high praise for a movie when it makes you reconsider just about anything. And certainly this is a movie that will maybe afford you some of the moments of clarity that Greta and Gabriel stumble onto after a long dinner, and that perhaps John Huston stumbled onto after his own long life. So that's The Dead from 1987. No, it's not some sort of vampire zombie movie. I would definitely recommend it.